So now to our panel of speakers who'll give a short intro ahead of the Q&A. So first we have Dr. Joanna Howe, who is Associate Professor in Law at University of Adelaide and a consultant with Harmer's Workplace Lawyers, and she's a leading expert on the legal regulation of temporary labour migration. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you, Sarina. So my research has been over a decade now looking at labour migration more generally, but in particular there's been two projects which I have led which have looked at labour challenges on farms in terms of two angles. So the first question has been, why are there persistent difficulties to attract workers to this industry and to retain them? And the second has been, why are the conditions why is there persistent claims of non-compliance, of exploitation on farms? Because typically if something's really valued and sought after, like a precious diamond, you would expect the price to be high, but it's rare. It's rare to find that diamond. And yet in horticulture, we have problems of shortages, but we also have problems of underpayment. And so those two contrasting issues had been the focus of my research, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities to talk about that today in this discussion. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sarina.
Thanks, Joanna. And to Taryn Mielerkamp. Now, Taryn is the Human Resources Director at Fresh Produce Group, one of Australia's most widespread and innovative fresh produce suppliers. Welcome, Taryn.
Thanks, Sarina. My name's Taryn. I am the Human Resources Director at Fresh Produce Group. Fresh Produce Group is a large vertically integrated business in horticulture. We have farms and distribution centres across Australia. I've been working in HR in horticulture for the last 10 years, and over the last 2 years I've been at the forefront of managing the challenges of COVID border closures and navigating our response to the labour shortage. I'm hoping to bring to this discussion my experience managing labour in horticulture industry, and including my participation in things such as our Pacific labour schemes. Looking forward to hearing everyone's questions and my colleagues' perspectives on some of the issues confronting the industry.
Thanks, Taryn. Now, Professor Felicity Blackstock from La Trobe University, where she's the Academic Lead of Industry Placements and formerly of Dairy Australia. She began her career looking at the innovative learning experiences for students. Felicity, I'll let you explain your work.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Sarina. So yes, I'm currently the Academic Lead of Industry Placements at La Trobe University and the previous Learning and Development Manager at Dairy Australia. So during my time at Dairy Australia, I was very much leading and working on three key pillars to support the dairy industry with addressing their workforce challenges. The first one being grounded in supporting dairy farmers to be fantastic employers and having the skills and capabilities they need to recruit and retain staff. Focus very much then on retaining great people in dairy and offering opportunities around learning and development for people to build their careers and maintain currency of practice. And then also attracting diverse people into dairy, which might be working with our team that's focused on the school sector, the vet sector, the higher education sector in terms of universities, but also all of our other careers awareness activities that we're doing. So specifically during this time at Dairy Australia, we transformed Extension to overcome the challenges of training during COVID-19. So we created an online platform and started to look at new models with on-farm coaching and online learning. And these online learning experience very much transformed to be interactive, not simply focused on information delivery, but chances to actually connect different farm businesses to actually brainstorm solutions and challenges that they're facing, both in workforce matters on farm, but also far more broadly thinking about animal productivity, milking, pastures, etc. farm business. Fortunately, this technology is going to continue being used because it overcomes geographical barriers for us, with agriculture being an incredibly geographically dispersed industry, and it's really challenging for people to connect with learning opportunities. We also developed new partnerships with the higher education sector and dairy farm managers, looking at new models of training for the vet sector using simulation for reproductive techniques, focus very much on supporting farmers with employment basics, managing and leading people on farm. Was a member of that Dairy Leadership Strategy Steering Group. So really looking at how do we support dairy to be great leaders on farm, leading self and leading the industry, because that's a critical piece to the workforce challenges. And then lastly, I'm now working in the education sector. So I have transitioned back there and very much advocating for how the education sector can actually support new graduates, the next generation, to be work ready and connect with industry and have that seamless experience and be the people that industry need them to be.
That's a really good cross-section of the workforce. We're looking at the problems, some of the solutions and how it's working in practice. So let's go straight to our questions. Thanks for the scene set. So first of all, a very popular question, this one. So how wide scale is the structural problem in Australian agriculture of attracting local workers? And is this a wages issue, or are there non-economic factors which make policy options more difficult? Who wants to go first? So, Joanna?
Sure. So in our research, we went around to 13 regional locations across Australia, and we were asking this very question, why are there so few locals in horticulture? And I noticed the minister's introduction talked about the many strategies they attempted in the last 2 years during the pandemic, where they threw everything but the kitchen sink at local Australians, many of whom lost their jobs, to try and incentivise them to go to the regions and to work in horticulture. I think the WA government had a marketing campaign of sort of like farmer wants a wife, go to a farm and you'll find your spouse, find love on a farm in Australia while picking fruit. And look, the reality is the migration settings have an impact on the ability to attract locals. So I think a key setting change was in the early 2000s when the Howard government allowed the backpacker visa extension, so that working holiday makers could come from overseas and work for 3 months on a farm and then get a second year on their visa. And so then what we saw for the next decade and a half is working holiday makers become a mainstay in the harvest workforce. And we saw that the country composition changed. So we saw a number of Southeast Asian countries and poorer nations where the wage differentials are higher, really using this as a visa, not for the purpose of a holiday, but for the purpose of work. We also saw the seasonal worker program created in the mid-2000s, which brought in workers from the Pacific. And so what our research found is that if the industry, and I'm just going to speak bluntly, if the industry becomes a ghetto, if you like, for exploited temporary migrants, and I'm not saying that that is the industry, but I'm saying that if that's the reputation of the industry, and we've had numerous reports now to suggest that there is a norm of non-compliance in horticulture, so I'm speaking specifically about hort, you are going to find it difficult to attract locals. So a casual at McDonald's can earn $27 working on the weekend at McDonald's or nights. And so the recent decision by the Fair Work Commission on the piece rates case found widespread wages non-compliance with piece rates. And if overseas workers have an incentive to accept lower wages, because for them, a migration outcome is tied to their employment. So for backpackers, they get a visa extension. For seasonal workers, they get the right to stay or the right to come back. But locals don't have those ties, so they're not going to accept lower wages. So I think wages are a key issue, that we have a structural norm of non-compliance. I also think there's a problem with a lack of career pathways, and I think I've spoken to some really innovative growers who are doing things in this regard. But one young Australian man that really echoes in my mind when I think about this issue is we met him in Virginia. He was working for a farm. He was 19 years old. He was really enjoying the work, but we asked him if he was going to stay in the industry, and he said, look, I think long term I'm going to have to move to something else because I just don't see a career for me. I can't pick fruit for the rest of my life. And so one of the chapters of our report in Towards a Durable Future looks at the lack of career pathways and the need to create those links. And I think some of the other speakers on the panel have a lot of experience in that regard. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sarina.
Yes, thanks, Joanna. Taryn, maybe you pick up from that. Career pathways is an interesting line from there, or would you like to answer the core question here, which is how widespread is this problem?
Look, I think this is a real issue. We over the last few years, there's been a range of different incentives for Australians to work on farms, such as the federal government relocation reimbursement. And although we've had thousands of workers on our farms over these years, I can only think of 2 people who've made that application and I've been contacted over. I think to understand the problem, it's really important to separate the different types of workers that you have on a horticultural farm. You have a number of roles that form your core workforce. Those roles are long-term, they're throughout the year, and they generally are filled by local workers and most often Australian workers. While recruitment in regional areas is always challenging, I normally have found that we don't struggle too much to fill those positions, and they are local jobs. The challenge we have is what I call contingent workers, and those are people that are brought in to do a specific task, such as pruning or harvesting. It needs to be performed over a limited time, and for large operations like ours, it needs significant numbers of people. So the real problem in filling these with Australian workers has to do with insecure work and the location. So, I think about our workforce planning like a mountain, and we start, for needing 50 people for 5 months of the year. And then when we're at our peak, we might need 400, but only for 3 weeks. And we're asking Australians to travel from cities where they do have the chance to have more secure and stable work, as Joanna mentioned, in McDonald's and places like that. We're asking them to move out to regional locations to fill casual, short-term roles. And really, to make a career out of it, you need a nomadic lifestyle. With low unemployment, it's not attractive. So I think that these other structural issues do have a significant impact on our ability to attract more local workforce to the industry.
And accommodation is a big thing that we might tackle a little bit later on.
My favourite topic, yeah.
Felicity, do you have a point to make on that, the wider economic issues affecting, this current short-term problem?
Look, I shall remain reasonably brief because I do echo particularly Taryn's comments about different roles on farm and therefore different pathways actually to echo Joanna's comment, and us actually as an industry being a little more strategic with who are we recruiting when for what pathway do they have. And one of the wonderful things about agriculture is actually there's almost a job for everybody. There are those lower skilled positions that are transient for someone who is in a backpacker lifestyle or a nomadic lifestyle. Then there are incredibly sophisticated roles as farm managers, which require really high levels of thinking to be able to successfully navigate a multi-million-dollar business and maintain its productivity and deal with the volatility of the industry too, between climate versus global changes, trade, strategy, etc. So we need to get much better at articulating those pathways. And that's probably, from my perspective, the structural part to this. And our farm business is getting better at choosing the right pathway to find the staff that they need. But I do also want to say that, yes, there are definitely non-economic factors at play here. There is culture and reputation from certainly a local domestic workforce perspective. I've had some wonderful conversations with young dairy farmers who, when you ask them, what are your top 5 reasons for working on the farm that you work on as an employee? Money comes in about 4 or 5. We do have to be realistic that people in Australia, cost of living in Australia is high, particularly when you factor in a lot to do with real estate. But sitting at the top is not money. Sitting at the top is the lifestyle. Sitting at the top is feeling valued for the day's work that they've done, that their boss is actually really valuing their contribution to the business and engaging them in business discussions, and they don't actually feel just like a minion running around, that they feel part of the team. So I think there's some real cultural opportunities for us in agriculture to shift our reputation and shift how we are engaging with everybody, immigration as well as our domestic workforce.
Here's a terrific question. Thanks, Felicity. For Taryn, what labour-saving practices and other innovations have you seen in agricultural businesses implement over the last 2 years to counter the effects of a tighter labour market? And I think you've probably got examples.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things that has been a big topic of conversation that I've really seen happen on our farms over these few years is looking at the way in which we actually manage our plants. So looking at how we set up and we prune and we do all of the activities in order to make our key labour intensive times, such as our harvest, easier and to reduce the number of workers that we need. I think this labour shortage has really put a focus on the whole farming operation and what we can do to reduce that big mountain, as I said. I think the other thing is shift in job design. I've seen that there's been more and more specialisation in roles. So shifting a lot of the practices where, say, when we're harvesting, we're doing more segregating the positions so that We're doing harvest activities on the farm, and we're sending the product away to our packing shed to be packed, which now allows us to gain productivity in each of those areas. I think this is going to continue to be a hot topic in horticulture as we have those structural changes with piece rates, and we're going to need to gain even more.
Let's get on to away from horticulture for a moment. And here was a popular question submitted by Terry Sim of Sheep Central. Thanks, Terry. So given there are Australian sheep shearing contractors ready to employ Pacific Island workers to alleviate the industry's shed hand and shearer shortage, why is access to the palm workers, Pacific workers, not being expedited?
Look, I actually think this is a very good question, and it actually points to a much larger issue, which is that we have a real problem that migration's become a political football. So to get anything done quickly in the migration space it's just not happening. And because we don't have the bipartisan support. So in 1996, when the 457 visa was introduced, Labor and Liberal agreed that this had to happen. It went through Parliament, and we had that, temporary skill shortage visa for industry. But if we can think about the horticulture space, the minister announced an agriculture visa that was meant to be operational by, I think it was announced in July, meant to be operational by end of September. We still don't have partner countries signed up. It's the next year, and that peak harvest over the summer has passed, and we still don't have it. With Pacific workers, which is a less controversial program, we, as Terry's pointed out, still not able to access the workforce that they need. And I think this points to the lack of tripartite leadership at a national level. So if I contrast this to New Zealand, where they've got one migration program to access agricultural workers, and it's through the RSC, which is the program for the Pacific, and it's run with government steering a group with peak employers and peak unions on it. So they have tremendous fights, but then they make a decision as a group about what's going to happen with that program. So employers wanted to increase the cap of Pacific workers coming in, and they had to convince the unions, and then it was a done deal for government. And it happened last year that the cap got increased. In the Australian context, we just don't have that kind of infrastructure. And John Azarias's National Agricultural Workforce Strategy Report, released last year, suggested that we really need to have it. We need tripartite leadership. We're going to keep getting these bottlenecks. We're going to have an ag visa that gets announced that doesn't get implemented. We're going to have a palm program that just isn't there in time for the growers that need it. And we need to take the fragmentation out of the way we make policy in migration, or nothing's going to change.
Yes, that's very interesting. I had just read that that New Zealand has expanded that RSE scheme, and it does seem to have everybody at the table, even if they are doing a bit of shouting. They're just shouting here, am I right? So that's probably one of the problems. We could move on to the next question. So is Australian agriculture's education and training system fit for purpose in providing future workers with relevant skills and technological knowledge for modern businesses? Felicity, that might be one for you to kick off, certainly.
Thanks, Sarina. So this is an interesting question, which I really want to say, yes, absolutely. Our education sector is fantastic. I'm passionate about lifelong learning, and in the famous words of Dr. Seuss, the more you learn, the more places you'll go. Disappointingly, though, I think the answer is no. And the reason why I say this is that I don't hear farmers telling their employees or their children to enrol in certificates or degrees to develop themselves and become highly skilled farmers through education. I don't see farmers themselves throughout their careers picking up those opportunities that the education sector might provide for them to get formal qualifications. We did a survey in dairy called The Power of People, and 16% of dairy farmers have a certificate qualification level, 16% have a diploma, and 13% have bachelor's degrees, with 30% completing year 10 or less of high school. So I think that particular data really does highlight to us why would you not take up an education opportunity? Because you don't actually see value in that. When you take up an education opportunity, you're investing in yourself. So why don't you see value? Possibly it's because you don't actually know what you don't know, but most likely it's because the system's not fit for purpose and meeting your needs. And this I firmly believe must change for agriculture to be achieve the goals that they're looking to achieve with $100 billion. We are going to have to work smarter, not harder, and really actually have the capabilities within our workforce to be able to do that. Agriculture is only going to get more sophisticated from here, with potential for climate variability and other volatilities within the industry. So we need to work together, industry, education and government, to actually overcome this transformation that's required. Ag in schools needs to be really normalised, not a special excursion or a guest speaker, but embedded in everyday classroom experiences. We need to stop doing siloed one-off activities in schools and TAFE and university. We need to create a system that has these clear pathways that are really accessible for everybody, not just people who come off a farm and our kids who have a 10th generation connection to agriculture, but anybody who has the aptitude, interest and motivation to actually connect with this amazing industry. So the really important thing is that we need to start talking about what does the agricultural workforce look like in actually 2040? Because educational transformation takes time. We can't talk about what we need today. We need to be talking about what the workforce needs to look like 10, 20 years from now, and build an education model about that. The education industry sector is really interested in working with industry. I know that in my current role at La Trobe, I look forward to hearing from industry to work with them. And I hope that the government will actually get a united approach to leading a transformation, bringing Department of Education alongside state level education departments, as well as the Department of Agriculture together, and actually move this forward, which everyone is talking about. We don't have work-ready graduates.
Do you have a specific example of what's working well? Maybe you've just come from dairy. So has there been a program that you piloted that, that could sort of show us how this can work much better, where people don't have to leave their farms, do the training, be upskilled?
Absolutely. So we've actually created a fabulous program called the Dairy Learning Plan, and we've partnered with 4 different universities across the country, and in fact also AgriFutures and their Horizon Scholarship. And I must congratulate April Brown at this moment in time for this particular piece of work. And this piece of work actually connects students who are in university classrooms with farm businesses to have on-farm experiences, and also with extension opportunities and the Australian Dairy Conference, so that they can start forming their professional networks. It is a challenge to actually take what you learn from the classroom and pragmatically apply it on farm. And we need to support them with that transition. And that is exactly what that piece of work is doing. And she's hoping to also transform it so that we have some internships with some really appropriate roles for those university graduates to step on farm, build themselves, and actually take on some of these really high level opportunities later on in life that are going to be there for them in 2030 and 2040.
Taryn, do you have a comment to make on the upskilling that's underway that can show us the future of how that's done?
Yeah, so I would echo Felicity's comments that education doesn't seem to play a significant role in individuals' perceptions of success. So if somebody wants to become a farm manager or wants to take on some of those more senior roles, it's not seen as a prerequisite to entering into those fields. I think one area that I would like to see further development in is vocational education. I think that there is often a significant focus on the management positions and the technical positions and the importance of connecting them through to education, where for many roles that are done on farm, they're skilled positions, do not require a university education, but that doesn't mean there's not value in developing their skills. So our vocational education system in regional areas could definitely use with improvements in accessibility and creating achievable programs that actually deliver tangible outcomes and tangible skills for individuals.
I know that the ABC has done lots of these stories where there has been worker shortages, spoken to companies that have sped up their robotics or the AI. So this is a question from the floor. Will automation and labour-saving technology hurt employment in our regional communities in the long term?
Brief comment on that. There are roles on farm that are repetitive, are not necessarily intellectually stimulating, potentially are actually quite muddy and dirty, and also create hazards for humans, be that biohazards because there's potential pathogens or manual handling hazards. And so I think there needs to be technology embraced on farm to actually improve the quality of the experience of working on a farm, and using technology to actually remove the parts to work that we don't necessarily enjoy as humans. And that, I think, will address some of our labour shortage problems. But as soon as we start using that technology, we're going to have new roles on farm. We shouldn't be afraid of embracing technology thinking it's going to replace us. We have something technology doesn't have, which is a brain. There will always be opportunities for humans because we'll need to control the technology. Over to you, Taryn.
Yeah, I really believe that this is going to create greater opportunities for regional communities. I think the roles that are required to support automation are sustainable positions. We're shifting away from needing these short-term quick fixes, bring big groups of people in and then moving out, and being able to create jobs that are more technical, more specialised, and will be roles that we need to attract local people in regional communities.
So this next question, I think, is perfect for Joanna to have a stab at. What can we learn from how other countries are approaching agricultural labour workforce shortages, and what's working for them can Australia learn from?
Thank you. We have done some comparative research, and I think something to acknowledge is that this is a problem in many countries. So many sort of richer developed nations really struggle to attract a horticulture workforce. And so they rely on temporary migrants. But the problem is when you rely on temporary migrants on various visas, it tends to be a revolving door. And so the skills because I think it's I spoke to many growers and workers as well. This is not unskilled work. It's work that you get much better at the more that you do. And there's efficiencies to be made from retaining people, even in the picking and packing work. And other countries have had similar problems to us. We looked at the US, the UK, Canada, Italy, and New Zealand. And really the only country that we felt had done this pretty well was New Zealand. And it's not perfect. But, what they did at the start of the 2000s is they got rid of multiple visa sources. So they had different visas to bring in workers from overseas to work on farms. And they got rid of that because it creates a race to the bottom between different groups of visas competing against each other. And we have that problem in Australia. We have the largest amount of agriculture visas in the world of any country. And there's a race to the bottom between seasonal workers from the Pacific, between backpackers, soon to be ASEAN workers from Asia, and undocumented migrants at the bottom. So New Zealand got rid of that competition. They also addressed the problem of undocumented migrants. And I note that, this is a real issue, I think, for industry bodies, and it goes to industry leadership because, the National Agricultural Workforce Strategy Report in Chapter 7 says, this industry cannot fix its labour issues unless we deal with the elephant in the room, which is the reliance on undocumented migrants. It's not universal, it's not consistent across Australia, but in certain places it is dominant. And I can back that up from our research. We went to a number of regional locations, at least one in WA, one in New South Wales, and one in Victoria, where when we asked the question, who uses undocumented migrants, there was almost 100% of growers who put their hands up and spoke to that question affirmatively. It's not something you see in the official data because it's very difficult to capture that unless you're doing qualitative face-to-face interviewing. People don't answer on a survey, yes, I use undocumented migrants. And the industry, in response to the ABARES report, has washed its hands of it and said, we don't support status resolution for undocumented migrants. And they've kind of swept that problem under the rug. And as a result, you cannot fix the norm of non-compliance unless you fix the reliance on undocumented migrants. So New Zealand did that. And then, as I said in my last response, they developed sort of a tripart management of that program. So they created a new program. They increased the enforcement. And I've spoken to Horticulture New Zealand leaders, and they say that in their industry, the cultural shift has been so significant that if growers see other growers being exploitative or doing something dodgy, they will report it to Horticulture New Zealand, who works with the department to investigate that employer, because they know it damages the reputation of the industry. And I spoke to the head of the Apple and Pears Association New Zealand, who said that they've been able to negotiate a higher contract price for apples and pears with their European retail markets because the quality of their product has improved, because the workforce is skilled and experienced because they keep coming back. So there are economic benefits, but I think there's a significant underlying problem in Australia that we are reliant on just a merry-go-round of undocumented migrants, temporary migrants, and we're not building skills. This is of course not everybody, but I would say it's enough to really taint the industry, and it's why the Australian reported last week that there are some Asian countries that are not signing up to the agriculture visa because of our reputation. So, I think I would say New Zealand is the country that I've seen does this best, but it is a problem in many, many countries.
The Kiwis punching above their weight and how we could learn from that. That's great. Thanks, Joanna. Maybe to the next question, and this is one for any one of you, I suppose, but how important is employer capability to attract and retain great people? And how can we shift the dial collectively?
So I'll jump in on that one because I have a quite a passionate response to that. Incredibly important. And I think Joanna's sentiments just there actually echoed how important employer capability is in terms of setting up great workplaces that are safe, workplaces that are compliant with industrial relations legislation. Legislation is there, yes, to create paperwork, but it's also there to make sure that we know what the right thing to do by people is, and we aren't accidentally engaging in any forms of modern slavery, etc. It's to make sure that people don't get hurt on farm and don't die on farm. Plus, there's also obviously the personal skills in being a great employer, the communication, the conflict resolution, the leadership, the having conversations with your staff to help them build a career in whatever commodity of agriculture we're talking about. So how do we do it collectively? That is a great question and a really challenging one. First of all, industry bodies like Dairy Australia advocating for the critical nature of employer capability and all talking the same sort of united approach around the criticality, calling out when people aren't doing great employment practices, which then actually do damage our reputation nationally and, by the sound of things from Joanna's perspective, internationally, because we won't shift the dial if we don't hold each other accountable or if we just let things that happen over our back fence go unnoticed. And then obviously we need to invest in building capabilities. That can be both directly of supporting employers themselves, but also helping them connect with recruitment firms, potentially work together to have a collective HR manager between multiple farms who shared. Employment is complex, very complex. And farmers can't be expected to do everything. So also, how do we connect them with experts in an efficient manner so that they can get great return on that investment of having great people on farm and not the constant revolving door of employees?
Taryn, it's a really good one for you, isn't it? Because you sit at the top of that tree and then you've got a multitude of employers basically and a multitude of small HR departments. How does it work in your fresh produce group?
Well, look, I think that this is a particularly important thing for our industry, and it's also an exciting space for the industry too. So I would love the opportunity for the industry to begin to talk about how we become great employers and how we can focus on creating great workspaces and competing competitively for employees, not just taking who we can, but actually competition. I think will drive improvements across the board for employees and employers. I do also agree that the comments that Felicity has made is it's about connecting businesses with human resources professionals. It is not something that's common, particularly in horticulture, even though some businesses might be large and might have some large workforces, they tend to have very tight and small management teams. I think that having more human resources professionals in our industry makes a difference. And certainly in our organisation, I'd like to feel that we contribute positively to creating positive workplaces for our employees too.
Thanks very much. So we'll go to the next question. And the questioner has asked, whilst I appreciate the push for core business strategies to focus on growth and sustainability from R&D and biosecurity and so on, why do we think labour is not a key strategic pillar for industry bodies and associations, given the constant problems and shortages? Joanna, can I ask you first? sustainability of labour?
So, it's interesting. The two reports that we wrote, the first, they were both commissioned by industry, which shows, a level of interest in looking at this labour shortages piece. And the title of the first report was Sustainable Solutions. And the second report was titled Towards a Durable Future. And what we were really trying to communicate to an industry audience is that we have to stop looking for the sugar fix, the cheap overseas worker, probably from a poor country, that will accept very low wages, probably not compliant with Australian minimum wage laws. And I think what we noticed in industry is that there's a real tension and there's a fragmentation. So about halfway through us doing these projects, the National Farmers Federation created the NFF Horticulture Council. And I think that was a really positive, long overdue move, because it brought together the different commodities who were all jumping up and down on the different soapboxes, arguing for different things. And it brought Elsveg into alignment with NFF Hort Council. But, I've spoken to that group a few times, and I think one of the problems that they face is just almost an existential problem. Is the problem of non-compliance with labour standards a few bad apples? Is it a case of a few bad growers doing the wrong thing and a few bad contractors? Or maybe it's a lot of bad contractors, but it's not many growers. Or is it a norm? Is it a structural problem? And, we've had multiple reports to say that it's the latter, but we haven't seen industry own the issue. And I think that's fundamental. And when we saw the piece rates case before the Fair Work Commission, we saw the Australian Fresh Produce Alliance and the NFF really try to fight the piece rates case on the basis that while there's some non-compliance, this can be addressed through a bit of tinkering. And I felt very sympathetic to the many good growers I met who use piece rates very effectively to create a very productive workforce. But the problem is when there's so many people doing the wrong thing, and when there's a reliance on undocumented workers and dodgy contractors, which are unregulated, and when the industry hasn't shown leadership on these issues, it becomes very, very difficult. And so the main thing that the industry has fought for is an ag visa and for more expanded migration pathways, without recognising that they've lost their social licence, that there are real issues with the industry saying, give us more visas, give us more overseas workers, when investigation after investigation is showing problems. So I think that there is a need for the industry bodies to step up and to own this issue and to face the difficult solutions that will result in structural change. There are growers that need to go out of business because their business model is based on exploiting workers. And there are other growers that can then pick up the slack and expand their operations because they have the economies of scale and the competency. But it's not just about large business. For example, in the Northern Territory, a small mango farmer that we interviewed, he brought in 6 workers on the seasonal worker program. It was more expensive for him to do so, but he was running a very sharp operation and making profits, even though that program is quite expensive. But he knew that it was a better program for him to use than the backpacker program, which is a revolving door, or undocumented migrants. So, it's not just about the small farms bad, big farms compliant. That's not what it is, and that's not what I'm saying. But the industry needs to recognise that there's some very hard decisions ahead, and just arguing for an agriculture visa without acknowledging the extent of the problem or being open to doing real hard work about it. So, for example, industry created the Fair Farms initiative through GrowCom in Queensland. Good program. But if I'll be honest with you, it doesn't involve, I'll just be honest, it doesn't involve unions. And yes, it's got involvement from the Fair Work Ombudsman, but they have very few inspectors across an entire country. We know that there's problems across this workforce, and while unions cause a lot of trouble for farmers, they are a necessary evil, if you like, if we're going to put it that way from the grower's perspective, in that they do monitor standards. And if we need to clean up the industry, they're a part of this and they're going to be involved. And we saw the impact that they can have in the piece rates case. And the Fair Farms program should be tripartite. Otherwise, it's just the good growers who sign up to that accreditation program and who use it. And it does nothing to affect the bad growers who are doing the wrong thing and getting away with it.
I could pick up on a few things there. There's another question that Taryn can answer. Has there been an increase in vertical integration or farmer-supplier cooperation during COVID?
there's certainly been an increase in farmer and supplier cooperation during COVID. One thing that I guess can only touch on has to do with the way that farmers have been managing labour, and there's certainly been a strong push for cooperative efforts with things like the entry into Pacific labour schemes, where we may not be able to provide a full solid period of work. So various growers have been sharing workers between and moving them between their time there. So I think that certainly it has prompted a lot of cooperation between farms that perhaps would not have existed before now.
There was a question on the screen that I wanted to go to. It has disappeared, so forgive me, but it was about the increasing, I suppose, anxiety about piecework rates. So if that can reappear, there we have it. So we are heavily relying on the piece rate payment, says this questioner. We set the rate at 50% of our own picking results per hour to incentivise and motivate staff to be more efficient. There are also workers who like to work on their pace and can't make it on the minimum hourly rate, which resulted in the loss of labour force. Any suggestions? Joanna? And then Taryn, maybe.
So I think this question is one that I'm sympathetic to, in that farms are very large, and piece rates can be a way of ensuring that people work at the pace that they want to work at. And so, this questioner maybe alludes to the fact that there's grey nomads perhaps that want to work at a slower pace, but ultimately earn a lesser income, but work more slowly. And with this new decision that's going to take effect in April, that's not going to be a possibility. There's a statutory floor, and you can only pay above it. And I do recognise that for a lot of growers, this is going to cause not inconsiderable pain, and I'm not actually certain about what the workforce approach, the HR kind of best practice approach is. I'll leave that to Taryn. But what I will say is, I think when you read that Fair Work Commission report, that decision, it really came down to the fact that this industry is heavily reliant on overseas workers, and there's very little enforcement of the piece rates requirement. And so even if there are good growers using it effectively to maximise productivity, it in many cases is really being exploited and undermined. And we did encounter that in our research. We encountered workers that went to Tasmania at the end of the season, and there were very few fruit on the trees, so they'd earn $20 a day because they just couldn't fill that bin up with the fruit. And we found a lot of examples of that. And that won't be possible, obviously, under this new model. So there's going to have to be structural change, and it is going to be difficult.
I think one important thing to remember with this is that this is not a new problem. The problem of having people who work at differing paces is one that's experienced across every single industry, with every employee, with everybody here who has staff knows that not everybody is as productive as each other. So we do have existing mechanisms to manage that. And a big part of that is motivation, understanding the value that those individuals have to your farming operation, and being able to facilitate them to be able to be as fast as they can to make them more productive. It's not an easy answer, because it will be more expensive, and people like that will end up losing out because they will not have sustainable positions. But I think that we do have tools that we can use to help motivate workers to work a bit and make it easier for them to work faster than they do.
We promised at Taryn that you might get a chance to talk about accommodation. Is that one of the tools to attract people? Or
absolutely, yes. You can't have people in regional areas if they don't have somewhere to live, and this is, in some of our locations, it is a crisis for us, and we do need to work with government to find solutions. And it's not just about any accommodation, it's quality accommodation and options, because people need, I'm a big supporter of choice and people having options. I think that pushes for better outcomes, and people need to be able to walk away from poor accommodation. But if it's the only thing that's available in the region, they get stuck. So accommodation, having effective, good quality accommodation in our regional areas is going to be important for sustaining our workforce.
Well, we know that accommodation has been a problem, and with floods destroying homes and fires having destroyed homes, this is an ongoing one that's the whole economy rather than, not just specific to agricultural labour. So one of the questioners has posted this one. Would there be value in having basic and universal training for ag workers, similar to the white card in construction? I've heard the idea referred to as a green card. Felicity.
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. So first of all, I think there'd be value in exploring this as a potential concept. The challenge that we have, though, obviously, is that there are shared skills that are transferable between different commodities, and then there are very specific skills related to each different commodity. So, I mean, a nice example might be operating certain machinery, such as tractors. You're going to see that across many different commodities, but obviously milking a cow is only occurring on dairy farms as the perfect example. So I think it can be part of our solution. I do think before we get to that stage, we need to do two things first. Again, say, what does our workforce need to look like? What skills and capabilities do they need to have across all the different areas? And I know we do have competencies articulated within the vet sector, but we're getting feedback that people are not coming out with the skills necessary. So it tells me there's a mismatch between what our VET sector is training and what our industry needs. Plus, we need to be future focused. And then we also need to be describing the pathways to get those competencies. Who are the right people to come in at this particular level on farm or this particular level on farm, and then have those training pathways. And I think as we evolve that conversation, it will then become clear whether such a green card actually would work. It would bring efficiencies to training, which is the incredible selling point to it. But it has to be done well, or you're going to have people come out with their green card. One size fits nobody, if that makes sense.
Taryn?
I think everybody who works on a farm needs to have some level of basic safety training. And I think there's a lot of value in providing just a basic competency and understanding of safety on farms. But I think the points that Felicity have made is exactly right. Is, what safety looks like, say, on a horticultural enterprise is not the same as what it's going to look like in dairy. And that's one of the challenges. We need to really scope that out and look at problems like accessibility to make sure that people could easily access that education and training and do it in a way that they're able to understand.
I also just want to jump in and say that our training model at the moment in Australia at that vet level, at that certificate level, actually is nuanced by each state because it's state government funded, not nationally government funded. So we also have some very significant challenges around developing anything like this that is a national green card, because each state drives their own resource allocation and agenda around what is offered where by the TAFE sector. And obviously, if I'm as a Victorian, I can't access easily the TAFE training in New South Wales without paying full fee because I'm not a New South Wales resident, and vice versa. So there's a lot of equity issues around that. And just to comment on Joanna's very valid points about industry needing to transform and change and industry bodies needing to lead it, industry bodies are interested in having this conversation, but it is an incredibly complex conversation. And as I mentioned, government funds training on all different levels. And so industry needs to work with government that needs to work with the education sector, or we're never going to solve this challenge of creating these pathways.
Thinking about this is a questioner has posed this one. So thinking about the $100 billion production target for agriculture for 2030, is a reliance on unskilled labour from overseas a necessity or an obstacle to growth? Joanna?
Look, I think it is I think overseas workers are a feature of every Western country that has, that has a horticulture industry. I can't think of a country in the world that relies predominantly on locals. And I think while we would like that perhaps to be the case, it just isn't. With automation and mechanisation, we will see more locals in the industry as the skill level of the jobs increases. And I think really for this to be sustainable, we need a well-regulated visa system that's monitored and enforced. So, I remember something a grower said to me is that there's so much policing at the front end of the seasonal worker program, but very little enforcement once the workers are here. And then for the backpacker visa, there's no enforcement. There's no policing at the beginning, the middle, or the end. And for undocumented workers who are the mainstay in some locations, there's nothing. There's just not even acknowledgement that they're there. And so we really do need a concrete policy if we're going to be that $100 billion industry. And it needs to be consistent. It needs to be bipartisan so that growers aren't just thinking that planning for the contingency of a changing government. It can't be that, all of a sudden Labor wins and we unravel all of these visa options for growers. So we really just need to do the hard yakka on getting together and thinking of a sustainable solution. And it's going to involve some level of regulation and some structural change.
So, here might be one of our last questions, and it's the role of the whole supply chain in this topic. It appears the major retailers in Australia are in a race to the bottom in loss leading on perishable products, resulting in a cost price squeeze on producers. Yet the same end of chain actors may also be hiding behind sustainability and modern slavery initiatives. So do we revisit a robust conversation about the viability of value?
Absolutely. So I think this is an excellent question. We've seen the major retailers do a lot of window dressing around this issue, and behind the scenes what they've done is they've kept that price war so that you can get, strawberries sometimes for less than $1.50 a punnet or $2 a punnet. Workers are being exploited if that's the price that the retailers are offering. We've seen the retailers contract the amount of growers that they'll use to sort of create a distance between them and the exploitation at the bottom of the chain. So we spoke to a lot of growers who lost their contracts with the retailers because the retailers will just use a few growers to hide behind, who are then being supplied by little operators and other contractors. And so they're just keeping that arm's length distance between the exploitation that occurs further down the line. So the supply chain has to be looked at. And I think we need a productivity commission sort of review of the supply chain in horticulture.
Taryn, you're right there in the middle of it.
I in my experience, certainly our supply chain takes part in a lot of conversations about this type of issue. I think there's no doubt that whenever you need to address the issues within an industry, that it is something that needs to touch on all areas across that. But in my experience, there has been a strong push and a strong drive to see change, including with education and working with large growers such as ours and smaller growers and our retailers as well.
There was a final comment here and a bit of a question. The green card is such a fantastic idea. Could this be geared more towards educating people to improve the cultural ecosystem of the sector and provide a basic understanding of the future we're all working towards and basic standards? Felicity?
Yeah, this is a lovely comment, and it's partly a question, but mostly a comment. Absolutely. Again, going back to how do we articulate pathways? How do we create a threshold benchmark? It could be used with our immigration processes as well for our lower skilled workers to make sure that they've met that threshold. And in fact, we could create platforms like passports or wallets or cards that are digitally transferable between different organisations that the person can actually carry as a bit like a digital CV of their competency and capabilities being ticked off. So absolutely, we can create a cultural ecosystem of safe practice on farm, valuing employees, describing the capabilities, and being future focused using technology to enable that.
A
final, minute comment from you, Joanna.
Just to thank ABARES for involving me in this, and I know that some of the things that I say are particularly hard to hear for the industry and for growers, and just to acknowledge that in working with AusVeg and NFF over the years, there has been some commitment to look at this issue, but just to encourage industry in particular to not just make the request for more workers from overseas, but to really put the hard yards in through working with unions and government to create genuine dialogue around sustainable solutions.
Taryn, a final minute comment from you.
I thank everybody for inviting me to participate. I think it's been wonderful to hear everyone's perspectives and to get an idea of the sort of questions that are floating around there in the ecosystem.
Felicity?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I hope that I have inspired thought and that actually industry, government, education, we can all come together to actually work on these solutions.
1 hour was never going to be quite enough to cover all these issues here, but you've certainly given it a good shot. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Joanna Howe, Taryn Mielenkamp, and Professor Felicity Blackstock. Thanks for tuning in this afternoon, and you can catch up with all the sessions on YouTube via the ABARES channel. Thank you and good afternoon.